The rise and fall of Napoleon. Brief of his rise and fall, Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the island of Corsica on August 15, 1769, and died on May 5, 1821 on St Helena after being forced into exile there due to losing the Battle of Waterloo that sealed the fate of him and his rule. Within no time, Napoleon rose to power as a military man amid the French Revolution that lasted from 1789 to 1799. He was a man of irresistible courage, extremely bold, and a skillful military strategist. During the initial period, he successfully led the Napoleonic Wars against various coalitions of European nations and expanded his empire to a great extent. He fought the Napoleonic Wars on both foreign fronts and at home. He brought reforms to sustain the weight of such wars and win them. In every war, he remained resolute, adamant, and firm. No failure could tar his courage, and he continued fighting with continuous vigor and zest. However, his campaigns turned almost all neighboring countries into his enemies as he led wars against every powerful country in Europe. On the contrary, his enemies forged a common unified front against France and performed a crushing defeat of Napoleon. Nevertheless, his repeated defeats can be partially attributed to the blunders that he himself committed, the most important of which was the decision to invade Russia. The environment and passion of Russian troops did not enable him to make any major inroads. However, after returning from Russia and his first exile, he was undeterred and invaded Belgium, meeting his fate at the Battle of Waterloo. The invasions of Russia and Belgium forced him to abdicate the throne and adopt an exiled life in the island of Elba. This video interestingly elaborates on his rise and fall. Please stay tuned to understand this historic period of Napoleon Bonaparte's rise and fall in European history. Napoleon Bonaparte was a military and political leader of France who changed the discourse of French and European history. He rose to power and prominence during the French Revolution that was caused by the estate system, absolutism, ideas stemming from the Enlightenment, food shortages, and the American Revolution. He rose rapidly in the army after he saved the governing French Directory by firing on royalist insurgents. He also led several successful campaigns during the Revolutionary Wars. He eventually seized political power in France in the year of 1799 through a coup d'etat and imposed himself as de facto leader of the French Republic as first consul from 1799 to 1804. He was a powerful and revolutionary leader, and owing to his authoritarian attributes, he became Emperor of the French from 1804 until 1814, and again in 1815. He had the qualities and ambitions for an empire, which he carved out of the European map for himself and France. He dominated European and global affairs for more than a decade while leading France against a series of coalitions in the Napoleonic Wars. His rise to power and his wars constitute some of the most significant events in European history. The Napoleonic Wars were a series of major global conflicts pitting the French Empire and its allies against Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. These wars were fought for the European supremacy that Napoleon desired. The main events and results of the war culminated in the defeat of Napoleon, first at the Battle of Leipzig and eventually to the capture of Paris in 1814. Napoleon, in his initial life, desired to establish French supremacy over Europe, but the Battle of Waterloo, in which Napoleon's forces were defeated by the British and Prussians, proved the final nail in his coffin. Excluding these defeats that proved fatal to his cause of dominating the breadth and length of Europe, Napoleon won all European wars and almost all battles, positioning him to build a large empire that ruled over continental Europe before its final collapse in 1815. He opted to extend the continental system and embargo Britain. He then invaded the Iberian Peninsula and declared his brother Joseph King of Spain. However, both Spain and Portugal could not bear French domination and rose in revolt, fighting in the Peninsular War tooth and nail, and led to the defeat of Napoleon's commanders there. Napoleon was all out in terms of dominating Europe and eventually launched an invasion of Russia in the summer of 1812. The invasion of Russia, however, did not favor him and resulted in the catastrophic retreat of Napoleon's Grand Army. Events took a new turn as Napoleon started losing war after war. These circumstances led both Prussia and Austria to join Russian forces in a sixth coalition against France. During his prime, he was fighting major wars with the aforementioned rivals for domination of Europe. Side by side, he was taking reforms at multiple levels to register economic progress and sustain his militarism for domination. This way, he instituted reforms in post-revolutionary France, starting with a complete overhaul of the governance system. He centralized the government and took power into his own hands. He reorganized the banking and educational systems, supported art and architecture, and improved relations between France and the Pope. However, he was destined to see the fall of his power, prestige, and the French Empire. Unfavorable environmental conditions, poor structure and position of his army due to non-stop warring, lack of competent and patriotic officers, and the superior tactics of his enemies all forced Napoleon to wage war from a disadvantageous position and eventually led to his demise. During the rising days of Napoleon, he succeeded to a major extent in restoring order from the all-out mayhem caused by the French Revolution. However, these reasons eventually tied his hands to frantically push his power in all directions and establish his irresistible position of power and domination. In order to ascertain the scenario of his eventual downfall, a thorough analysis of the reasons behind the wars that practically put an end to his rule must be carried out. In light of the situation, and in spite of the early successes in establishing his supremacy over every nook and cranny of Europe, he made some calculated blunders. For instance, one of the blunders he made was his vision and plan to sustain and strengthen his continental system. With this decree, he hoped to severely weaken his primary state rival, England. As a result of this decree, he pushed other neutral countries to stop doing business with England. He wanted to create economic recession in England. Under this strategic approach, he also tried his best to win the loyalty of the French allies. However, England had bountiful natural resources for her needs and was in a good position to sustain the pressure and still remain economically viable. On the contrary, with his continental system, Napoleon actually weakened France. France became embroiled in the Peninsular War against Spain and Portugal, who were aided by Great Britain. Now it was a war between France and England, wherein France could not get the upper hand, contrary to Napoleon's imagined plan. This weakened the French position. Moreover, at the same time, and this timing was not good for France, Napoleon had cast his eye towards conquering the Iberian Peninsula and succeeded in doing so in 1808. His brother, Joseph, was installed as the King of Spain, but the Spanish rose in revolt and eventually put an end to his regime. The whole country was throbbing with unprecedented stress and strain. It merits a mention here that during the Napoleonic Wars, Spain was a French ally. Meanwhile, the Peninsular War turned out to be quite costly, and although the French won against Spain, this was a turning point in Napoleon's reign. The main reason was that his allies became suspicious of Napoleon's designs and started considering him a land grabber. Spain distanced herself from France, and thus Napoleon received setbacks on this front. Moreover, as he was a shrewd and ambitious military strategist and political ruler, he remained undeterred and even decided to invade Russia. This, as a matter of fact, sealed his fate. This pushed him into a position that, 2 years later, forced him to abdicate his imperial titles and power. With this invasion, he had hoped to gain political advantage over both Russia and Poland and to defeat the Russian army. But this hope was dashed to the ground and proved rather disastrous for his rule that he had fought so fiercely for. Not only was it freezing cold, but the Russians were certainly not open to any engagements with the French. They retreated, but not before enacting a scorched earth policy, one in which they burned all the crops as they moved further away from the French. This left Napoleon's troops with little to eat. All totaled, the French army would lose hundreds of thousands of men during the 6-month invasion. The invasion was characterized by freezing cold, Russian troops constantly tricked Napoleon, and the Russian troops who had retreated were burnt as they moved further away from the French. In fact, the Russians often opted to commit suicide rather than to let the French dominate them. This passion and the freezing cold cut the supply to the French army, and they would lose hundreds of thousands of men during the 6-month invasion. They had nothing to eat. The turn of events complicated and weakened his position. In the month of June 1815, Napoleon's list of enemy countries had grown to include Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia due to his actions. They made a combined effort to defeat Napoleon and his army. By this time, Napoleon's tried and tested strategies were beginning to falter. The coalition countries became a unified force against the French Empire. Even in these trying times, Napoleon hoped to eventually defeat his enemies, but he was only daydreaming. The situation had completely changed. He resorted only to take his enemies by surprise, but still, nothing happened in his favor. In the wilderness, he even proceeded with his warmongering. He invaded Belgium, and here he had to meet a historical defeat. He had to meet his Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo began, and eventually his dwindling and weakening army had to accept defeat. This marked the final defeat for his reign. He had no option but to be exiled to the island of St Helena, where he breathed his last at the age of just 51 years. History tells and teaches us one crucial lesson: that every power rises and subsequently falls. This also holds true for Napoleon. He was a thoughtful and practical military strategist. He had left no stone unturned to defeat the powers of his time, and in the initial stage of his career, he succeeded. But his success proved futile and historically momentous. He had enemies, but his allies eventually realized his true aims and started distancing themselves from the French Empire. England, Russia, Belgium, Prussia, and Austria all fought his rule. He made every other country his enemy. He started committing blunder after blunder, and when he aimed to invade Russia and then even Belgium, his fate was sealed and his rule came to a permanent end, forcing him into exiled life, during which he succumbed to death. Last, but not the least, there is one commonality between Napoleon and Adolf Hitler. Both in their dying days committed the blunder to invade Russia that brought their downfall. Hope this video has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. You can also follow us on our official Facebook page and Instagram for keeping up to date on the latest and freshest news on world events. So please follow and subscribe.